Good morning, everyone. We are students from SUNY Albany, and I'm Juliana Svistova. I'm a PhD candidate, and my two wonderful colleagues.
Hi, I'm Lara Bowen, and I'm a second-year doctoral student at SUNY Albany.
I'm Meera Bhatt, and I'm also a second-year doctoral student.
All right, so what we're going to talk about today is something that we called global origins and practice of critical social work using the techniques of pedagogy of the oppressed and theater of the oppressed. The name on the schedule was a little different because we also are putting it together as a chapter in a book, something connected to holistic education and social work. So a little bit of a background. This class was designed for community and organizational theory class. It's an undergraduate social work course, and it happened last fall. It was designed for a 3-hour class on community practice. It was targeted towards developing and practicing critical thinking and diversity skills, the competencies of EPAS. And the key objectives were to introduce global origins of participatory social work practice, more specifically through the techniques and philosophy of Freire and Boal. To apply, and also not only to present the content, but to apply and practice the techniques that they used in their own activism and their own approach to education. So we started the classroom. It was divided actually in 3 sections, but it's basically 2 sections. First we did the pedagogy of the oppressed, and then we did theater of the oppressed. But also, last time we did it, we also collected some feedback, and we'll present it at the end of the presentation. So we started the class by introducing what is it about, who is Paolo Freire, what the concepts are, what his philosophy was. The names of the books in the parentheses are key resources for preparing for the class. And we started with presenting his work with the illiterate peasants in Brazil, what is the concept of object acted upon is, what the culture of silence is. The key concept of his approach to education was critical consciousness, so we explained how it develops, how it starts, and how people become critically aware. We talked about dialogical reflection versus banking education, where people are just empty accounts that where information needs to be injected. His idea of that once man or person understands a challenge, understands how problems are constructed and how they function, once understanding is out there, the person cannot just sit still. Person begins acting or gets involved. And that through changing our thinking, we can change our reality. These are 2 examples of images. So he used a lot of images because he worked with the illiterate peasants in Brazil. And these are the examples of some images that he used to deconstruct reality, to understand what nature is and what culture is. So in the first image, you would talk about one of the clear distinctions is the feathers of the bird, and it's a representation of nature. And the person has a feather here, and it's used more as a cultural articraft now. So they kind of look at them and distinguish that. And the key idea from here is that we know that nature is out there, nature is beyond our control, but culture is what we create and co-construct. Hence, we can redo it, we can deconstruct and reconstruct. And it's powerful. These images and many more, I think they have 10 examples in the first book, or second book, the Education for Critical Consciousness. It was mentioned in one of the first slides. So you also present the concepts of codification, decodification, and new codification. So basically coming or evolving from conforming the reality to reforming reality to starting to transform it. And then the concept of practice, where the combination of reflection and action. And finally, the questioning strategy that is used towards images to critically assess them and question what we see. It's called show technique, and it stands for what we see, what do we see in the image? What is really happening there? How does it affect our lives? Why is it happening? How can we become empowered? And what can we do about the situation that is represented in the image? So for our own class, we used a whole group activity. We presented these images of the Hampton University students, and the images were taken from a book. Those were university archives. So we start with the first image on your left, and we see, so we start questioning. So what do you see? What is happening? Then we go to the next slide, and as you can see, these are the same people as in the first slide. So discussion begins to evolve. What is happening? Why is this happening? What can we do? How can we become empowered? Why is this happening? What can we do to change this and or not to perpetuate this? And here again, so we start with the activity and kind of engage students first, and then we introduce what the project or the institute was about and what the project was, what it was called, the Indian experiment. And the books outlined, the 4 books outlined here are the resources. One of them has the images, and the older ones, the 1874 is actually a very old book. It's interesting read to see how they frame education and emancipation. And then we also explain students that these images were taken as an outcome measurement. So they were taking a picture of pre-intervention and post-educational experiment. And now I'll pass word to Lara.
Okay. So then we took a break. This is actually designed as a 2-hour class. So we took a break, and then, well, last time we did it was a little bit longer. We've done it twice. The first time we did it as a 2-hour class. The second time we did it as almost a 3-hour class. So you can design it and cut it where you like and where you don't. Okay, so then we talked about theater of the oppressed, and we discussed Augusto Boal, who was a contemporary of Freire. And he applied Freire's ideas that Freire had used in education, he applied it to theater. So Boal saw the power of theater as being controlled by the ruling class, and this was a way to perpetuate the status quo, much in the same way his friend Freire had described education and pedagogy and education and literacy. So he drew a parallel of Freire's ideas about banking information with the students, but the relationship of student and teacher, he also drew the parallel between audience and performer. And so he described the relationship between performance and audience as unequal and unidirectional and oppressive. So as an aside, there is actually a whole field in the communication field. There are theories, transportation theory, parasocial interaction theory, and that you can, if you're interested in this kind of relationship of persuasion strategy, communication field has studied this a lot. And so, and for the purpose of sometimes marketing or for health education also can be applied. So, however, Freire criticized this dynamic And both Freire and Boal recognized the transformational form power of dialogue versus just a one-way. And they felt that dialogue is democracy. Okay. So Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, it was a theatrical movement that started in 1971, and it was also the title of his book, and it was a homage to Freire. So Boal's movement transformed theater and in turn transformed reality. Through his recognition of the power of theater, he developed what he termed the people's theater, in which he staged many theatrical events in which the audience actively participated. So these theatrical events were geared towards political activism and directed the power of theory in the service of social justice. So we reviewed this with the students and talked about the different kinds of theater that Boal founded, the newspaper theater, forum theater, image theater, and legislative theater. And you can go into as much detail as you want about that or not. Would you like to hear a little bit more about them here today? Okay. All right, so the newspaper theater, what he would do is, because the audiences were generally perhaps not literate, they would take newspaper articles about the same topic from different publications, and then they would cut them out and juxtapose them and have them read aloud. So they would take turns reading the descriptions of things and and by juxtaposing the ideas, they were able to bring to light how an ideology can inform the way a message is presented, or and how things can be biased. The forum theater was the idea that it transformed the audience from spectator into what he called spect-actor. And so they would do an improvisation or a scripted piece, and then the audience was invited to interact by, there was a facilitator, and that facilitator was Boal. In the People's Theater, it was called the Joker. So I don't know if you've ever been to health education. This kind of strategy is used a lot, where there are interactions with the audience, and the audience can interact with the characters, asking them questions and also suggesting ideas for alternate endings. And sometimes, depending on how ambitious your students are, they'll come up and take the place of the person on the stage and say, wait, let me show you how I think it should be done. So the invisible theater isn't up here, but invisible theater was also where they wouldn't necessarily build a set and have the action in a theater. They would go to, for example, a restaurant and start a scene in a restaurant about an issue. I saw an interview with Boal where he talked about there's a law in Brazil that no person should be refused food at a restaurant, and yet there's still hunger. And at the time it was very hot issue. So they would do, for example, in a restaurant, have a conflict about that and really get loud and boisterous and get people involved. And people wouldn't know that it's a theater, performance, because at the time, if you were acting and doing this kind of political activism, you could be arrested. So they made it like, oh no, we're just citizens. We're here and we're being, we're getting a lot of attention, but it wasn't stricted, it wasn't planned. Now the image theater, this is a performance that doesn't rely on words, but uses things like movement, space, and sounds and visual statements. So could be like a dance, it could be like positioning yourself in space to show different kinds of relationships. And this image theater, we felt would be, since the students are social workers and not actors, we thought that this, as a first introduction, could be something that we could play with them and have them do something like this. So, and I'll get back to that, but the legislative theater was that in the fall of 1992, Boal ran as an at-large candidate for the position of vereador of Rio, a position similar to a city council seat in the United States. And using the forum concept, he employed the dynamics of theater to discuss what kind of legislation needs to be enacted. And so what he would do is that he would address community problems and get feedback from the community and have that inform his proposals when he was a legislator. And he would ask the people what they wanted, and that's how he got the information. Okay, so after we talked about it with discussion questions, and we did a group activity with them that based on the image theater, and you can explain it, that first we did a warm-up depending on how much time you have. You could do a warm-up to get them talking, do a discussion. We applied it with their internship and field because this was given in the fall to BSW students, and so it was around the October time, right, when they were kind of switching roles from starting to take on the role as a social work intern. And so we talked about tell a story that has to do with your internship or placement. And first tell it to each other and discuss about it and find some common information about that. And what it's like to assume the role for the first time, what kind of challenges and feelings that you have. And you can have different, you can facilitate that discussion in small groups. And then when the group, after they've kind of formed a little bit of a team cohesiveness, you can ask them also, have you noticed any examples of this is just an example of what we did. You could use it anyway. We said, have you noticed any examples of difference in your internship? Have you noticed people experiencing marginalization or bias? And have you yourself seen or heard any bias or discrimination within the context of your internship or field placement? And what we did was we had them do a basic exercise that's an example of image theater called body sculpting. Have you ever heard of this? It's used sometimes. It's where the students, they themselves use their bodies to create an image, a sculpture, and they can show through the spatial relationships, perhaps power, what their role is. They could do it still, or they could do it movement. They could add sound if they wanted, but not necessarily talking, explaining. If they wanted to use some kind of sound or word repetitively or motion repetitively, they could do that. And then we invited the volunteer groups to present and let the rest of the class see and interpret the sculptures. So one thing is that they wanted to be right about guessing what the sculpture was, but we tried to get them away from that. Just like, well, what are you seeing? What's happening? So here's some examples. We took some pictures of the last time we did the class. And then the discussion questions to debrief, we asked them, what kind of patterns are observed in the sculptures. One thing we also noticed was that the social worker in each sculpture a lot of times was taking notes, which I was surprised to see that. So it's how can one transform from a note taker to an agent of social change? And how does seeing differ from interpreting, judging? Oops. And what stereotypes and biases surfaced in sculpting and discussing why? Okay, now I'd like to introduce Mira. She's going to talk a little bit about what we learned. Go on.
So these were some of the lessons we learned sort of the first time and then the second time again. It's very important to think through how these students and these groups are going to be divided. It could be completely at random, but people don't like being moved around in the class. There's a fair amount of reluctance around that. They tend to look for the right answers. They all want to be right. And to them, that was the goal of the class. To be right, to be able to guess what the sculpture is, to be able to sort of judge to some extent whether somebody did right or not. And it's important that they understand it right. There was a group that made some sort of a sculpture, but basically they were all trying to represent what all their internships were. The idea was to represent any one thing and talk about a certain situation. It's important to remember that a big part of the goal of this activity is their own self-awareness, and not so much the sculpture. It is important that they're understanding what the dynamics of the placement that they're in, and the placement is just one example of a situation that you can use. You can ask them to actually talk about a social situation or a problem in a community they've seen, anything. Students may get emotional, they may get emotional around the issue, around being right, around various things. So it's important, because it is a process of self-awareness, it is very important to recognize that and to address it in the class. Also from the feedback that we got, we learned that it is important to sort of balance the presentation with information as well as sort of method and activities, because there's all kinds of learners in a class. Students like and enjoy the interactive style. Most like being pushed out of their comfort zones. It's more engaging. They eventually appreciate it. They don't when you're trying to divide them into groups. But however, we learned after these few experiences that it is important to let volunteers come and present. That is not something we did. And in the next slide, we'll see feedback, and that was one of the few negative things or negative feedback that we got, that we didn't want to present. Sort of thing. I think I will leave you to read these. And so, sort of overall, I think most of the feedback says that they like the whole sort of combination of activities and content, and different people like different things. They were a little uncomfortable. They liked stepping out of the comfort zone. Some people said the whole volunteer thing. But generally speaking, I think the feedback was pretty positive. Some food for thought for all you educators and us. How do we as educators ensure that all these concepts are internalized, and not talking about this particular presentation, but just generally social work theory, the social science content that we teach in class, everything, and that is important because it is important that our teaching leads them to be agents of social change and not agents of social control or note takers. And it's very important to be able to distinguish between those two. And the other thing that we thought was that it is important that all the senses or sort of various kinds of learners are catered to. And we're teaching holistically to all their senses, and that way they learn better.